for this Harvard Library Strategic Conversation, which is co-sponsored by the Office of the Senior Associate Provost. Thank you so much for coming. I'm catching my speaker with her mouth full, so I'm going to speak a little slowly as I introduce our panel and remind you that we're here to talk about student research and the role and the possibilities for librarians and faculty and teaching fellows working together. Today we have Alison Head, who is the co-director and co-principal investigator, forgive me while I read it so I don't make mistakes, of Project Information Literacy, a research scientist at the Information School at the University of Washington, and this year, happily for us, a fellow at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society and the Library Innovation Lab here at Harvard. We have my dear friends, R.J. Jenkins, who is a graduate student in the Department of English working on his dissertation, and a famously effective teaching fellow and collaborator, and Jane Unruh, who is a preceptor in expository writing and a member of the Harvard College Writing Program, and Stephanie Kennan, who is the director of the program in general education here. So we have faculty members and teaching fellows and research scientists and a group of very engaged librarians to talk with all of you about how today's college students think about the information landscape, how they conduct the research for their coursework, how we can learn from and work with instructors and teaching fellows, what our best and next practices should be working with the curriculum, and how we make progress together in critical areas like academic integrity, and what an effective curricular encounter with library research looks like now, what it could look like, and how we can create the partnerships we need to move forward. So it's my pleasure to introduce Alison Head.
Hi everybody, I'm Alison Head. I'm the lead researcher for Project Information Literacy. Harvard College has been in 3 out of 5 of our studies. So I've got 10 minutes here and then they're going to give me the hook. So let me see if I can summarize some of the key findings.
Do you mind speaking into the microphone?
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Sorry. This okay? Let me see if I can summarize some of the key findings from 5 of our studies, focusing on 3 of them that include never released data about Harvard, a couple of things that I found in my data files. But before we start, my tech associate, Julia here, is going to show a video that we made for today. It's a short video.
So my research style is somewhere between high school, where they forced you to do their techniques, and then college, where they don't really care, just as long as you write a good paper.
Do you use librarians? I don't. The library is pretty well laid out. You can just search for materials online.
But the honors research project was really good, though. Librarians showed you how you look for sources and how sources link to other sources. It's something I've never even thought about before.
I like it when the professor gives you something to write about, because that makes the whole first part easier.
I know. When you pick your own topic, you just don't know if it's going to be appropriate for that class.
I'm always trying to gauge what a professor knows and the best stuff they think I should use.
But office hours? Oh, I had this professor say, I went to this medieval neighborhood in Italy as part of my research. Now, how am I going to turn in a paper next week that keeps this guy happy?
I know. It seems like none of the old-timers, especially the old professors, can really give us much advice on sorting through and evaluating resources. I think we're kind of one of the first generations to have too much information, as opposed to too little.
By the way, that video is often librarians as well as faculty students are told me. They use it as a basis for starting a conversation on different topics, and it's have that used.
I'm sorry, I have to mention again.
Oh,
we are taping.
Okay. It's really hard for me not to walk around. Okay, I'll stay put. Okay. Anyway, back to you. Anyway, the videos are good for jump-starting a conversation about some of these issues. Something that we didn't intend when we made the videos. We thought it was more of a way to get the findings out to people that followed our research. But all the videos, I think we've made about 8 or 9, are open access. You're free to use them, and they're on our website. It's something that we produce besides the research results as well. So the slides, let's see. This is what I want to do over the next 8 or 9 minutes here. This is kind of a challenge for me, but it's an interesting one, and I get asked more and more as this project continues. And that is to summarize what's important about PIL. What have we really found out? Here are 5 findings from our research. A couple of these findings, actually, I pulled out data about Harvard College students, which may be of particular interest to you since you work with them. The first question is, it's where the video ended, which is, what is most difficult about conducting research? We actually asked this question in 2009 in a survey that Harvard College students were in, about 2,300 students total, and then about 490 Harvard College students. And we also asked it in 2010 with 8,300 students. It's only published in the 2010 study. So let's sneak and look at what Harvard said in 2009. What we found was, at Harvard, the research angst, as one student called it, really came down to 2 things for our survey sample of over 490 students. This was sophomore, juniors, and seniors. Sometimes people ask me that. We don't include freshmen. We see them as unique, often making this transition into a college environment. I'd like to study them later, actually. So the 2 things that came up the most were writing the paper and narrowing down the topic. Overall, so that you can have some comparative ability, I looked up the stats this morning, and narrowing down the topic was something that was difficult overall across the 25 schools when we asked in 2010. But it was much higher overall. It was as high as 2/3, 62%. So it wasn't as much of a problem at Harvard narrowing down a topic. Often people at Harvard, when I present, ask me, how are Harvard students unique? I think this is one way they're unique, and I'll point to a couple of more as well. Writing the paper also came in first. That wasn't the case when we asked in 2010. If you know our research, it was defining a topic, narrowing it down, getting started. So an interesting distinction. The second finding, yet another study. The second finding is, how are librarians useful? And how are they helpful when students are going through the course-related research process? That is, from getting an assignment to actually finishing the paper, doing the research, and writing it up. And what we found was resources versus services. This has happened overall throughout our research finding that we've had. Were important at Harvard Library. And what students said were most important were the research library databases. Another unique quality of the Harvard College students were the book and journal collection. If you look at our 2010 study, book and journal collection print on the shelves wasn't as high at all. So this is another unique part of Harvard. Study areas are always a majority, over 50%. How are instructors most helpful? This is interesting, and we'll probably talk about it with the different panelists, but often, and you can tell from the video, which are actually taken from focus groups that we've conducted between 2009 and 2011, and follow-up interviews, often students go to instructors, not librarians. They go to instructors as research coaches, which a number of those quotes in the study, in the video just referred to. So at Harvard, how are instructors helpful? Availability by email, like in our larger study in 2010, comes in number 1. This is the number 1 thing that students find as far as helpfulness from instructors. a unique quality of Harvard College students, and that is that one-on-one individual sessions with instructors, teaching fellows, as well as professors, was seen as something very helpful on this campus. Overall, in the 2010 study, it wasn't nearly as high. I've got my stats over there if you want to ask me later. Written guidelines, actually, and this is the assignment handouts that we'll be talking about throughout the session. These handouts that professors give to students, not all instructors use them, but a lot of instructors do. This was quite high as well. And in fact, it was the jumping off point for this study, which is the research assignment handout study, which will be the focus of today's conversation. The shortest PIL study, by the way. Usually our studies tend to be about 70 pages. I think this one is maybe 40 with appendices. Excuse me. I'll leave the mic for a minute. Okay, I'm back. Just a couple of comments in framing the research assignment handout study. Harvard, by the way, was in the sample. In full disclosure, we only have 5 handouts from Harvard faculty. So we have 28 institutions in this sample from the US, but recognize, this isn't a huge amount of handouts from Harvard professors. Overall, the handout study, I think, can be summed up as saying that the handouts really emphasized the formalized prescriptive steps of preparing a paper, much more than they emphasized how to find information or the process of inquiry. Big distinction here. So what students ended up doing, and we'd heard this before in focus groups, students end up looking at the handouts, no wonder they like them, almost as a contract that they can check off things. I was a professor for 25 years. I always gave handouts thinking, this will really help and we can cover all these different things. And every single semester, a student would approach me and say, you gave me a C and I did everything. It's 5 pages. I used MLA style and my margins are set correctly. I never had those kinds of details. But really, these handouts can be more powerful tools, I would argue, in framing what the process of inquiry is, and also in guiding students. This is a librarian issue, in different resources to use. I'm only skimming the kind of the surface here if you've read the study. However, I think what's surprising here, and this is overall, it's not Harvard pulled out because there aren't many handouts here. But if you're curious, let me know, I can look it up for you. But 60% of the handouts sent students. The #1 place they sent students to do research for research assignments was to the shelves in the library for a discrete single copy book. And if you've ever been in a large lecture hall and remember college, when the professor says that or sends out the handout, somebody slips out the back and usually checks that book out. And there you are, and nobody has the book, and you debate about whether buying it on Amazon or seeing if you can find it someplace else, or if it's, in today's time, if it's online. Only 14%, yet another area of concern that I bring up, is if you look at the resources that libraries have and the databases that they offer, only 14% of the handouts specifically sent students to different databases. And by that I mean the scholarly databases produced by ProQuest and the different vendors. The #1 database mentioned was Jstor. So we had heard things like this with students when we'd done interviews and focus groups where a student would say, my database is Jstor. Another student said, my database is Psych Ed. That's what a professor told me when I was a freshman. I don't go to the other ones. This may be a source of where some of this happens. Also, another thing, truth in advertising. Obviously, there are other ways that professors coach students besides giving them a handout in most cases. We make this clear in the study, and I want to emphasize this here. Professors use office hours, as it came up in the video, but they also have discussions in classes. There are other ways that this information is communicated. What I think is so interesting about research assignments as an artifact is that students take them with them. And often the student who is afraid to approach a professor, or who doesn't live on campus, or doesn't engage the professor, will rely on that handout. And again, that habit of a student to look at a handout after the fact and say, I've done everything, it's an A paper. We conclude by saying in the report, this is probably my favorite quote from the report, most students lack a seminal understanding about what conducting research means, which is really a focus of the work we do at PIL. We're very interested in this. Research, especially as a form of inquiry, of intellectual inquiry as well as discovery. And the large majority of handouts actually did not provide that kind of context that would have really helped students frame the process. Often what you hear from students when you talk to them is, why did I get an A paper on this research assignment? And when I did it the same way in the next semester for a different class, I got a C. That there isn't a strong, deep understanding of what the process of inquiry entails and what it's about as an organic process, something of mutable inquiry. So I'll end on that note, bring my panelists up. Stephanie, Ann, and RJ, let's get into it. And so I'm anxious to hear what you have to say. This is the first time I've presented on this study. And I have to say, I probably get the most questions overall when I spoke at the Berkman. It always comes up. It's probably my favorite study. So I'm really honored to be here. I'll move over here now. Different way. Okay. Is this me? Oh, okay. That's okay. Okay, I'm going to be quiet. And for once, let's see.
Sure. So, not to derail us, but just to add a little bit of context about sort of what this looks like on the ground. I've been asked to come in my capacity as a teaching fellow, and I'm going to lower the level of discourse just a little bit here. Excuse me. But I want to basically take all of this wonderful information that has just been presented and give us a sense of what this actually looks like in my classroom. And wonderfully, I wasn't aware of the presentation, the actual details, but you'll see a lot of echoes, and I think it'll help us continue the conversation. So a conversation between me and my students. I'm not going to read this. I'll just let you go ahead and read it. This will take about 1 minute and 30 seconds. This is a pretty recent photo of me, by the way. I made sure it was as recent as possible. This is how I get through the day. Snooki uses Jstor. The statistic about Jstor to me is just astonishing because I put it in here as a kind of joke. But it derives its power from the fact that it's so true, that this is sort of the one electronic resource that students feel wedded to and familiar with. Those are the Winklevoss twins, in case you were wondering. Okay. So this just gives you a sense of what this research looks like when it plays out. And to me, there are basically 5 things that I'd like to put on the table as part of our larger conversation from being sort of in these rooms. So this is not a statistic. This is not from any sort of research I've come up with. This is basically anecdotal, and less than half is a colloquialism. It's not meant to be a percentage. But essentially, imagine what you think undergraduates know about conducting research in academic libraries. They know much, much less than the conservative estimation that you have, not because they're not fiercely intelligent, not because they're not incredibly savvy, but because, as Alison pointed out, they don't know how to get started. You actually have students walk in and out of Widener 2 or 3 times before they actually make it into the room with the computers. It's also my sense, increasingly, that students think that they can reap the benefits of our incredible library system without ever moving. And that's because they're a product of the age that they grew up in. We are increasingly digitizing information, and so what happens is that the value of walking on one's feet into a room and speaking to a person is a little bit lost on them, and it's our responsibility, armed with the kind of data that we have here, to help them learn how to do that. I've been astonished that even at this age where students seem so sort of world-wise and a little bit jaded, when you show them what is here, they are uniformly amazed by what is here. And they'll say incredible things like, you know, I can touch this. You know, I can touch that. Yes, you can touch it. You know, that kind of a question that you get is not an expression of naivete, but really an expression of wonder. And they don't have access to that wonder a lot of times unless we help them. And telling them to go to Jstor doesn't help. This is actually, I should have put this in quotes. This is not mine. This is from a Q evaluation from a junior tutorial that I taught, where we worked with Laura Farwell Blake for an hour. And this quote, 1 hour with a living, breathing librarian is worth hours of electronic self-help. I have this on a piece of paper taped to my desk. Again, the question is, how do you develop these partnerships? In my experience, partnering with librarians and libraries, partnering with the resources we have, leads to astonishing learning outcomes. And I know I say this at a particularly political moment, but oh well. The quicker we recognize that libraries are living systems comprised of books and people, the better off we'll be. So to me, what's exciting is the fact that this conversation is taking place. And so I think what we need to figure out is, you know, Alison said something wonderful, which is that students come to their instructors to get coaching on research. The secret is that instructors go to librarians to coach us on research. I didn't know a damn thing when I got here as a graduate student. So I think helping connect our students to the people who help us is kind of an important idea. So these are just a couple of talking points I wanted to put on the table, give you a sense of the angle at which I'm approaching some of this information. And I think that a couple of other of the panelists are going to do something similar, just say a word about the angle that they come from, and then we can continue our conversation. Thank you very much.
I don't have any pictures, but I thought it's actually easier for you to see me if I stand over here than sit over there. So I wear a number of different hats. I'm director of the new Gen Ed program, and in that role, I see a lot of different classes. I see course proposals. I see assignment proposals. I talk to faculty about assignments, et cetera. And I'm also Associate Dean of Undergraduate Education, so I have a very broad view of the curriculum from beginning to end. And I just wanted to bring up a couple of topics in terms of thinking about the research experience from a curricular perspective and from a pedagogical perspective. So in some ways from the student's perspective and from the faculty's perspective. So the first, and all of you who've worked with students at different times and moments have noticed this, but just to lay it out, that there's a developmental process in research as there is for writing and all cognitive work. So students are doing something very different in XPOS, which Jane will talk a little bit about, than they are in their senior thesis. And there are stages in between that in terms of the sophistication of what's being asked of them, the sophistication of their own cognitive development, how they think about questions, how they think about sources, what it is that they're able to do and are being asked to do. Similarly, there are disciplinary differences, or maybe divisional, the sort of humanities, social sciences, and natural sciences. And so there are different kinds of assignments that students get when this is something in and for their concentration, and what they have been trained and how that assignment fits with their development as a junior historian or as a junior molecular biologist. And then they take things in gen ed, and they take electives. And so there, the expectations may be quite different. Their experience with what they've learned so far might be quite sophisticated in their concentration, and then they're thrown into a course with a very different set of expectations. And all of a sudden, they start from scratch. And sometimes, as we know, the faculty don't pay attention to that difference either for them. And then I think from the faculty perspective, you know, in gen ed, I spend a lot of time wishing I could tell faculty two things, or ask them two things. And sometimes I can, but I have to have a really good relationship with them. One is, can you remember what it's like, or what it was like, not to know anything about this topic? And perhaps more importantly, can you remember what it was like not to find it self-evidently fascinating? So that a faculty member's passion for his or her topic is necessary but not sufficient. And how do we get our faculty, who are the best in the world in these very narrow research realms, to think about, how do I communicate why the light bulb went off for me? Why and how and when did this become what I wanted to do? And what was it like when I used to stare at my faculty member and be like, huh? So similarly, faculty don't remember what it's like not to do research. They don't remember what it was like before their passionate intellectual curiosity became channeled into scholarly form and practice. And so that, I think, is one of the places where librarians can really bridge these gaps and help bridge these gaps, is one, by helping to articulate some of those steps in between, the forgotten knowledge. And two, you know, it really is for faculty, it's about intellectual curiosity. And as we know, our students are often achievement-oriented, and their intellectual curiosity, if they have any, is secondary to jumping through the hoops and doing what's expected of them and doing that well. And I think one of the reasons that students don't know where to start is that they don't know what's interesting to them, and they don't know why. So engaging a student with, what's interesting about this question? Why do you want to answer this question? Well, it's because also an assignment. Well, why this topic as opposed to some other way to get at that? You know, I think that's one of the things that would really, that kind of framing questions is one of the things, and then you see the light bulb go off sometimes, if you're lucky. You see them engage, and you see them get on fire, and then they want to find out. I was actually at a memorial service for a faculty member in my department a couple of years ago, and his wife was telling this story about how she told her husband when they first met on their first date that she loved blackbirds. And he said, well, what do they eat, and where do they nest, and how do they... And she looked at him like, I don't know. And he said, well, don't you want to find out everything you can about something you love? So that's, in a way, that's what our faculty do, right? They find out everything there is to know about something they love. They don't always frame it that way for themselves, but I think that's one of the hooks to get undergraduates who don't understand what research is and are intimidated by doing something original. How can I possibly, as a sophomore at Harvard, contribute original research to Widener, right? It's very intimidating. But getting them to figure out for themselves, or even ask that question for the first time. What is it that I find interesting about this? And how do you turn that interest into a topic and into a question and then eventually into a thesis? So those are sort of a couple of thoughts about how, And I think I don't think any of it's unique to Harvard, but I think some of it's highlighted at Harvard in terms of the gap between who our students are and where they start, and who our faculty are and where they start. And it's that gap in between in terms of the expectations that I think we're all trying to figure out how we might bridge. So I'll just leave you with that, and we'll talk more.
I think I'll just stay here to mix things up a little bit. My name is Jane Unruh, and first of all, I'm very happy to be here today. I'd like to thank Laura and Alison and Sue for inviting me. I teach expository writing to freshmen. It's a required course. And my class is called The Voice of Authority. So we talk about authority on a lot of different levels, but we also talk about it with regard to writing and speaking with authority. What does this look like? What would it mean to have it? What would I sound like, or how would I read if I had it? So this theme is quite useful in many ways. My class is about process in many ways. It's, of course, for freshmen, and it's interesting to me. I think about these things a lot, about sources and why students reach for sources and how they've been trained to reach for sources in various ways. And some of what I do is, I wouldn't say to undo what they've learned or help them to unlearn what they've learned. I wouldn't say that at all, because we're trying to help them build on what they've learned, but maybe to stop and think about things that they really haven't stopped and thought about before, like what is a position? What does it mean to have a position? And as we're now moving into the research unit in my class, a unit that I think we've been preparing for since, in a way, the first day of class, I really encourage students to know that they don't have a position until research, lots of research, makes first a new position necessary and helps them to perhaps even in a kind of mosaic way craft one. And I think that this shift can be liberating for them, because they are used to having one and then going out and getting things and supporting it and backing it and then adding in something called counter-argument. So, of course, it doesn't really work that way. And so having them stop and think about these things is extremely useful, because they're so smart and they really want to be stimulated and they want to feel necessary in the scholarly conversation, even as freshmen. So some shifts, some conversations about such small things like a thesis or a position can be extremely, extremely useful. Another thing that I've been discovering is the importance of creating opportunities for combinations of activities and ways of thinking about things. For example, the virtual work teamed up with talking to human beings and having conversations. The solitary work that they know how to do, they're doing it all the time, combined with group discussion or meetings with librarians. This is really important, I think, combining these sorts of, realms or environments and putting them in dialogue with each other. Another is combining the abstract and the concrete. And one thing that I've been trying, which has been, I think, quite successful, is having students, as part of their research process, write a research diary, keep a research diary. It's interesting to see how they approach this. Some have little notebooks. I actually thought of, well, I'll give them the kind of notebook I use. And I thought, well, that would be crazy, because they don't all want that kind of notebook. And they don't. They have all different ways of keeping track of things and logging things, and they're very savvy. And I do have some notebook writers as well. But this has been really interesting, because they are very invested in the process then, and in the end they become the author of a research narrative, which is a document that is a kind of translation of the research diary into narrative form, and this accompanies their final draft. And one thing that I think that is very scary about research, maybe more so now than in the past, is that you don't have much to show for it, particularly the failures or the dead ends, yet people are telling you, embrace the dead ends, embrace the fact that you might not turn up anything on Tuesday. But if you have a research diary that becomes filled in with the dead ends and the narratives around the dead ends, then you really do have something. And I think that this gives them confidence. It gives them confidence in going forth with research, going deeper into research, looking for more things. But it also makes them feel as though they aren't leaving the library empty-handed, or they aren't leaving their rooms after after doing lots of online searches empty-handed, because they have this interesting, unique, highly individualized document to show for it that they then translate into a narrative. One thing that has happened with this process, and I should note that in expository writing, students write and revise 3 essays. The first essay is a primary source essay about a novel, and they're not allowed to use any sources, and this is scary for them because they really want to use sources to explain the novel. They want to contextualize it in history or explain complicated abstract notions that are hard to decipher and understand by connecting them to things that they can easily find. So this is frustrating for them. In the second essay, they meet the authors who've written the text they're writing about, and they can use those conversations. So this, they realize, is really going to complicate things. And they start to value this, I think, and see what a big deal it is to reach for a source. After all, if the author explained a metaphor one way, but you understood it another way, what do you do? How do you deal with this moment? So research has been, I guess in a way, they've been forbidden from doing it in the first 2 units, and so now suddenly they have to write this big paper, and they're excited, and I think they also, on a certain level, understand that it's a big deal to reach for sources, but they also have to find them and use them. So I think that this process of writing, having a conference, and then doing more research. Before I had the research diary, which will become a research narrative, I wasn't seeing as much post-draft conference research. I wasn't seeing that as much, but I'm seeing more now. And I have to think it has something to do with the research diary and the fact that they're going to need another part of that diary because the research narrative is 2 parts. It's pre-draft and pre-revision or post-draft. And that's the research that I'm so excited about, because this is where students are saying, after we talk to our little groups about our papers, for example, we realize that we really aren't convincing and we don't have this kind of evidence, or I haven't given voice to these people who apparently are at the center of my debate, yet I haven't even heard from them yet. And so in the research narratives, I'm seeing descriptions of students on a mission to do research because they really know that they need it in order to convince their reader. And I think that this is something to think about, the importance of the concrete document and of the narrative in the process and of creating a history of the process itself, that I think really this can be very useful, particularly in these days. Thank you.
Now it's our turn. Your questions, your conversation, whatever you would like to ask the panelists, I'm sure they're ready and happy to respond. So please let us know. Debbie?
This may be for Jane, but also Alison, maybe you can answer it anecdotally. I'm interested in what percentage of freshmen have actually written research papers in high school, have had that experience.
I'll answer first because it's an easy answer. We haven't studied freshmen. So we don't know, but I think that's fascinating. I'd love to do that study.
I do this 10-minute conference with each student at the start of the semester, and I sort of wish I'd been recording these all along because it ends up, I think I have some kind of study in a way, but I don't really. But I ask them questions about what kind of writing they've done and if they like to write, what kind of feedback they've gotten on their writing in the past, and how they would evaluate themselves as writers at this point. And I would say that most of them have done some research. They've written a research paper. But again, I don't think that a necessitated process of research is really a part of that. I think that we were given a prompt, we were given a topic, we were given clear boundaries, and we went and did research. So I think a good number of them have done that. But that, I think, is very different from what I'm at least asking them to do, and this is just a freshman course, and that's to have to come up with boundaries, create them yourself, and then also necessitate a real journey, a research journey yourself. So I would say a lot of them, but not real research.
Do you think this has changed over the time? I don't know how long you've been doing this.
I've been teaching for 45 years. No, I've been doing this for 5 years here and doing these little conferences. So I haven't seen, I've seen shifts in reading. I've seen less reading, students who've read fewer novels, definitely. But I don't know that I've seen a big change in that in terms of whether or not they've done research. But again, I think it's research that is for a very different reason, and I think they feel less deeply connected to that as a process. I think it was about completing something and getting it done and having it look as though it's the product of research done in the correct way.
I will add one thing just on the tail end of that. We did ask a question which kind of got at what you're where the discussion's going in your comments, which I love, which are great. And that is, we asked a question in 2010 with our largest sample of what routines do you use for working on research assignments, really trying to get under that transition from high school to college. And we also did follow-up interviews in that area and found, in fact, there's a direct quote that we've used in the video, that a number of students, one of my favorite comments was, well, I just don't use the cards anymore. We always used index cards. That was high school. I got rid of those, but I just use the same routines from high school and apply them in college, and it gets me through. So there is some evidence, I think, from our research. I'd love to study freshmen, though, and look at that more deeply about that transition process. But there's some, it does seem to be some sort of carryover. Another quote that I pulled that's in the video was something else that I found so interesting was, in high school, they cared about our techniques on research assignments. A lot of students had done research assignments, and they really don't care in college. They just care that I write a good paper. In other words, there were other quotes in the follow-up interviews. Our interviews are about 30 minutes with students that have taken the survey that volunteer. And students talked about professors don't have time to care, which is kind of a sad statement. Oh, Harvard wasn't in that sample.
I will say one very quick thing, too, that I've noticed, and I've also been teaching here for 5 years and working as a tutor in Lowell House and having a lot of conversations with students. And one, I don't know if trend is too strong a word, but I thought this was fascinating, and I've heard it many, many times. Students coming from really excellent schools, oftentimes, counterintuitively, are the ones who have never done a research paper, because their teachers felt they were above citation, that they were above sources, because the emphasis, now, and this is very, very interesting, the emphasis was on critical thinking and writing. So the idea was that citation, anyone can do that. Anyone can find a book, anyone can find a journal article. So what's fascinating is a lot of times the students who are the most familiar with methods of citation are the ones that come from high schools where you might not expect that kind of attention. And some of my students who come from these very, very elite schools are a little bit more trained in the critical thought, but have never, ever written a citation in their life. So it's interesting. You have to really, I think, these conversations at the beginning of the term, you know, these students throw you curveballs about where they come from and what their preparation has been. And not every student who went to an excellent school knows how to write a research paper, even if they're a little better at developing a research topic, for example. So, you know, you're working with populations, really the skills that they have and the experience that they have, you really need to gauge that early to figure out what your strategy is going to be.
That's enough on the high school station. Next. Andrew.
I'd like to ask the question at the other end. I work in a professional school, and so what are reasonable expectations for students in the professional school who've gone through college, who've gone through that development process of supposedly?
I'm on it. I'm glad you asked that, actually, because it's a thread running through these comments. Right now, Project Information Literacy is doing a study, it's IMLS funded, where we call it internally, although I really like the title, so it probably will be our end title too, which is The Day After Graduation. And I was telling Cheryl about this. So far, what we've done is we've interviewed 25 what we call employer stakeholders. This has always been a difficulty, just very briefly, in the research, that employers don't understand information literacy, solving information problems, research. We haven't found that to be the case. We've interviewed different employers, hands-on, working with students, recent grads in internships, as well as their first job at places like Smithsonian, Brookings Institution, Microsoft, FBI. I mean, sample's kind of crazy, but we wanted it to be. We wanted it to be a spectrum of different workplaces. And the questions we asked were, what are your expectations at the interview stage? What do you end up with? What are they successful with when they come through the door? Not after you kind of train them and massage them and make them who you want them to be. And then lastly, what are their shortcomings? And I'm so excited about this study. I've already done some of the analysis. At the same time, we've been coding the interviews for, just as a guidance, information literacy standards, as well as habits of the mind. And they seem to be loading pretty heavily on the theme that everybody has touched on, which is the lack of social learning that occurs in the workplace, that is an expectation of employers. Your exact comment of the research diaries is so right on, because as several of the employers said in their interviews, it's not just about finding the answer. It's not an assignment. I have a recent grad come in and I always say, what mistakes did you make? Which is, exactly what Jane's talking about. The other thing is getting beyond something that all of us have touched on, I think, leaving the screen. As one of the first interview I did, I thought, boy, where are these going? The first interview I did, the woman said, she got pretty relaxed, she said, can't they just pick up the goddamn phone? And I said, okay. And she said, they won't leave the screen. And the answer's always there. And the other thing, which is particularly problematic, we've all had jobs, is working interdependently and thinking interdependently. That is with teams. There are a lot of implications here educationally. Something that keeps striking me as I think about this study, and I'll just leave this one point here because I do think about the implications, is the dreaded group project. And students roll their eyes. They're like your slides. You get the same response, only you get a little more antagonism. Of I'm not doing that. I'm not working with these people. Has that changed? Why did group projects fail? Is that a way to get social learning? And also underlying this, really the topic of today, knowing how to be a good researcher. And realizing I love what you said, you're gonna make mistakes and you might not be able to check it off, but in the workplace, you do. So stay tuned, it will be out later this fall. And also, you'll be happy to know, it's a little advertisement, we're doing focus groups, thanks to Susan Pless, who worked her way with the alumni folks, and Mary Lee Kennedy as well as you too. We worked a lot on this, to get a random sample of Harvard College grads within the last 7 years to do 2 focus groups. And so we can say also, in addition to the employer stakeholders, what's it like out there? It's an exploratory qualitative study in preparation for something that would be more quantitative and large scale, but also getting at the issue of what's stuck from college. How do you stay smart? One of my favorite questions that I asked a number of years ago at a college, where a student said, my biggest thing in life, the biggest surprise about information, nobody gives you the reading list in life. I was smart, and then I graduated, and a month later, I was dumb again. I thought, that's so profound. It's so interesting that somebody would expect in a workplace, everybody to kind of say, okay, this is geology, this is anthropology, this is Dickens. Thanks for asking that.
At Harvard, about half of our students write senior theses. So unlike Princeton, for example, where they all write them, we don't require it of all of our students, but about half write senior theses. A good chunk of them write it because it gets them honors, some level of honors, rather than writing it because they actually care and want to do this project. One of the things that I found for thesis writers, I used to teach in the history of science department, and I don't anymore, but I ran the senior thesis tutorial, so I was not just my own students, but dealing with all of them. And that was a department, actually, at that point, they all had to. So I dealt with a lot of students who probably didn't really want to and probably shouldn't have been writing a senior thesis. But there's this point in December, January, where they start freaking out. And the kinds of things that I would often say to them were, actually I would say this at the very beginning, if you approach this as one giant assignment for me, you are going to hate every minute of it. That once you get to that kind of research, whether it's the size of a thesis or some sort of research project, where really the assignment in this class is to do research, as opposed to some term paper at the end. And it's that moment around December, January, where their draft of their first chapter is due. And they start to make that shift of ownership. And the ones who never make that shift, they hate it. The thesis is a disaster. They hate the whole, But it's also a moment where I would say to them, look, if you learn nothing else, so this is sort of the mistakes, if you learn nothing else from this process, then how to embark on a big project differently, that's a useful thing to learn. Because this is in many ways the first thing, this is a huge project. A senior thesis is a huge process. Some of them have been trained very well leading up to that, certain kinds of junior tutorial papers, research papers. Some of them haven't. Some of them kind of get plopped in the middle of it. And it's like, you're probably never, unless you go to graduate school, unless you go even to, depends on the kind of graduate school, what kind of writing you're going to do. Unless you're going to a PhD program, you're probably never going to write something like this again. But you are, no matter what you do in life, going to embark on a large, complex task that is plopped in your lap and you don't know where to start or how to organize it. So even if you just learn, I would never do it this way again. Right. That's a huge thing to learn. Right. But I think more to your question, just as there's a gap between what they are left with from high school, even the best prepared students, and what we expect of them when they get here, tacitly expect of them when they get here, there's a similar huge gap between even, maybe not the best, the best of the kids here, they'll outpublish me any day. But most of the really solid kids here who do very well on their thesis, who do very well on their research, there's still a gap between those kids and what they can do and how they understand writing and research and what people expect of them that they already know how to do the minute they start a graduate program. So I think similarly, it's a similar kind of gap between high school and starting college and between finishing college and starting graduate school, whether professional schools or not. And again, it's those sort of, okay, what was it like before I knew how to do this? And for professional schools, I think especially, they're coming from very varied kinds of backgrounds. You could come to, I don't know what school you work for, but you could come to the business school, you could come to the divinity school, you could come to any of these schools, not majoring in that, And in some ways, the kids who are the best historians who go on to PhD programs are probably better prepared, the best of them, for what they're going to be expected to do than when they shift, because they're so focused, well, one, they're so focused on the achievement, what is the expectations and how do I jump through this hoop and how do I do what they want me to do? But also the expectations are quite different. And there are always those shifts and everybody assumes, didn't they get this in high school or didn't they get this as an undergraduate? And there's a lot of tacit assumptions that we all make about who our students are and what they know how to do, as RJ was saying. They know less than half of what we think they know to start with, or at least that would be a safe assumption.
That's right.
And we can always be pleasantly surprised. But so I think it's a similar gap.
It's interesting. We get undergraduates working. I meant thesis. We get undergraduates working on their senior thesis as well as graduate students doing whatever. And the undergraduates tend to be more data focused. The ones that travel to paper. And also, they tend to work alone, whereas in a business school,
made. So they are, by and large, you know, Harvard assignments in Harvard classes are the solitary scholar kind of assignments. This is something that's changing a lot in gen ed. There are different kinds of creative assignments that might still require research, but they might not be writing, and group projects. And one of the things that we actually have a lot of trouble with is getting faculty to think through being very transparent with students. Because we actually have a couple of faculty from the business school teaching in gen ed, and they just do things the way they do it, and it's like, oh God, no, you can't do that. So the students, of course, are very concerned about how is my individual contribution going to be graded and evaluated, and what if there's a slacker on the team, and you know, all that. They get very concerned about that. But that's how they're going to be working out in the world. They're going to be, you know, largely doing team and collaborative work, and they don't really know how to do that. And we could actually get into some questions about academic integrity along those lines if that comes up.
I saw another hand. Where was it? Well, I do want you to talk about academic integrity.
There was a hand over there.
I'm sorry. Whose hand was it? Raise it.
In a different direction.
Okay. And then you. Tracy, go ahead. That's okay.
I'm trying to think about how any of what I'm hearing, it should influence the way we do design and build user interfaces for students. And I hear a lot these days about the fact that we're trying to solve this problem of search and discovery, or that we're trying to make research seamless. I love the title, it's complicated, because it is complicated. But I'm just trying to think about how, I think from the perspective of someone who's trying to design interfaces that are used and used well, it's not just a matter of trying to make it easy for people. It is trying to figure out how to contribute to the research process in a way that is very useful and productive. And I'm just interested from your perspectives if you have insights into that.
You know what strikes me? I used to do usability for HP and Sun and work on a lot of intranets within libraries, within those companies, and also marketing. Something we did in that environment that really helped engineers, researchers in those settings was, sure, they had all these incredible resources, and on the page we really prioritized how to go through the process, and even with a larger font size or you know, some positioning, kind of the politics of the home page, really. And what I find with academic sites so often, everything's on the same, there's an equality. And I understand why, for some reasons. You can't say, well, I like ProQuest better than Cengage. But it strikes me as interesting. And what you hear from students is, you know, they often go to whatever's at the top, or a box. And there's certainly some allure to getting started, but they're not sure what's most important. You know, when I use University of Washington's site, I find the same thing, which is where I'm based. I have to think through, wait, how do you do good research? And I have a PhD in library and information science, and I'm kind of amused that I have to think, I expect their interface to communicate more. Instead of, we have all this stuff, which, you know, we find students complain bitterly about in our research studies. That makes the process all the more cumbersome, problematic, the pressure's on.
But we don't want them to just go to Jstor.
Right, exactly.
I would say so I don't know the answer at all, even a tiny bit, even this much, but I want to just tell a quick story that I think may be helpful. This is not about creating a web interface, but we did create an interface. Laura Farwell-Blake, Stephanie Kennan, Sue Gilroy, primarily responsible. Don't worry, her name was on my list for sure. Best for last. Sue, I taught a course with Professor Luc Menand on the Cold War last year, a period that students are fascinated by but don't know very much about, and they had one of these assignments where they had to do a research project where they had to go find primary source material to look at. And I'm a Victorianist by training. I work on George Eliot and Charles Dickens. I don't know anything about the Cold War, so obviously I'm the head TF. And so here's a situation where students come to the instructor for help, and the instructor needs to turn to their library colleagues. So what we decided to do, and there is an answer at the end of this, was to create an interface, a print interface for students that basically gave them a sense of what there was. It was called a destination exercise, and the reason for that was that they had to physically go to a place. So to the person working at the business school, the fact that a student showed up physically at the business school, you're already dealing with a certain kind of student. So we created a destinations guide, and basically, and by we I mean Sue, and I can, the royal we, and basically what it did, it described the assignment, and then it gave the students a sense of where at Harvard they could go to find stuff. And what it did that was wonderful is it actually reproduced some of the stuff that we have and showed them that it existed. And then Sue went in and she gave us a sense of, and here you can see what, where, and why. Possibilities for students. Examples that might make the archives an interesting destination. Next, the Gutman Education Library. And again, possibilities for students. Know before you go that it has special hours. The kind of, I just have to say, the answer to the question that I would give is when the student feels that the resource is being made for them, that someone knows something real about what they have to do, I think it really changes the game. And that creates a lot of work, obviously, to create this kind of personalization and this intimacy. Houghton Library, Harvard Map Collection. I mean, students had no concept that Harvard had a map collection and that it was in Lamont of all places. I mean, it astonished them, et cetera, et cetera. And here, of course, probably the richest Cold War site for us that students had never even heard of this space, many of them. The kind of work that we got was outstanding. I mean, if the biggest problem we ran into, I think in some cases, is that librarians were not quite prepared for the volume of physical bodies that were inhabiting their spaces. I mean, we had 450 students in the course. So they were all over the place looking for this stuff that they felt like they could actually find because someone gave them a taste, right? Sue, do you want to say anything else about this? I mean, this is your baby, but this is success. This is an interface that succeeded for us.
This is something that actually there were lots of librarians who were probably in this room who contributed to because they provided me with the information that I was able to then put together. What I saw happen were those really wonderful moments where somebody does have that light bulb go off. The one I always love to tell is the girl who was doing, it was Griswold, New Connecticut. And we went up to look at actual Time magazines because they had to take a photo of it or bring back the evidence that they had actually done this. And when we opened the page up, she saw that next to the little bit of information about the decision was a cigarette ad. And she talked about how, wow, things had really changed because contraception's now okay, but cigarettes are not. But there's wonderful kind of things happening just in terms of, encountering knowledge. And we saw kids that wanted to do sciences looking up, say, the papers of Oppenheimer that we have on microfilm. So they could find a way to make it their own. Now, I'm sure there were probably plenty who did I have to get this done, I have to. But, by and large, it was really nice to see. I mean, as a librarian, just to see people just get excited about information in many different kinds. Somebody wrote about using the microfilm.
Yes.
To one of the TFs and said she had actually helped to get the research knowledge out because she was a freshman, and had brought a couple of her roommates with her. So they all sort of like learned about microfilm. And
a fairly large contingent of the football team, actually, about 20 members of the Harvard football team showed up to the microfiche room, to I think the slight terror of the people already there, to look up the very first issue of Playboy magazine, which, to their chagrin, was actually a very different publication when it first came out. But this is the kind of thing, what we discovered is that interfaces that are able to move bodies in this incredibly disembodied moment, interfaces that get bodies moving into spaces, into contact with human beings and physical, there's something about a thing that is still very powerful. And I think that that's part of this, even to speak to Jane's point about the research diary, the research journal, the thingness at the end is profound for people. So I don't know how that, I don't know how that answers or doesn't answer the interface question, but I think ways to generate intimacy of knowledge and of connection, I think can really do big things, and it certainly did big things for us. You'll be happy to know I think the course is on offer again, which we didn't expect. So
not in the same form.
Oh, never mind.
Film at 11.
The goal is not to just track people onto a screen and keep them there, which I think is sometimes sort of give them everything they ever want and do it in a way that completely handles and satisfies all their needs and makes them feel like they're completely Googleized or whatever.
Right.
When in fact, maybe that's not the right thing.
Right.
In fact, probably not.
Yeah, I mean, this was a remarkably successful and exciting endeavor. There was another class in the Gen Ed program last year that was also about teaching with objects, and that worked with the museum collections, the tangible things endeavor. And that had a similar effect. Students, the last day of that class, students were asking, why don't more courses teach with sources? Why can't I do this in other classes? It was like, great, go ask your professor if you can write from an object. An object is a source. But I think this also goes back to one of the things I said at the beginning is about the developmental, this is a research project. Right. This is not a research paper. This is not a, this is not a senior thesis, but this is a research project in the sense of I'm going to go find a thing and learn something about it. And that's, and that ignited, it was a very large class. If maybe half of them got excited and might do this again, that's fabulous. I think on the other extreme, one of the things I've often thought about is, I was, in graduate school in that transition from the, all those, my graduate professor took me to the library and showed me like the British Museum catalog and those big books, and I learned how to do that. And the transition to all the digital, and one of the things that the students really struggle with is that they don't have any concept of classificatory systems, even that the idea that there would be one. So they approach information as if it's Google, and the universe is the World Wide Web, and it's all just out there, and what's the right keyword, And even I used to sit with the old Hollis, and they'd come to me and they'd say, I can't find anything on this topic. I was like, what do you mean you can't find anything on this topic? And I get on there, and 5 minutes later I have, because I knew that there was a Library of Congress subject heading that I needed to hit, I needed to find that. It wasn't the right keyword. I needed to find that, and then things would open up. So, one of the, and I don't know how this deals with the interface problem, but it's an infrastructure problem, and it's a cognitive problem that the overwhelm is partly because they don't have any taxonomies, and they don't even know what that might mean. So again, it's not so much interface, but it's not that kind of interface, but it's this kind of interface saying, oh, well, let's think of what kinds of categories we might use to look for things. And how do you think about those categories? Not just the Library of Congress categories, but what are the natural kinds that they are starting with that they don't actually know that they've got in their heads? And then how do you translate that into library cataloging? So it's a very different kind of problem, but I think the thing that RJ and Sue worked on was very much about how do you ignite them? you know, and that's what I was talking about before. How do you get their attention? How do you get them excited? And then the other kind of problem is, how do you help them understand how to navigate what feels overwhelming but doesn't have to be? And some of that is, how do you put stuff in piles and start to narrow down the piles and then focus attention that way?
Do you still have a question? Yes.
There's no question that having the original item at hand is an incomparable experience. But we also spend an incredible amount of time and resources creating digital collections, providing online access to primary source materials and special collections materials without any clear picture of whether or not students are using them, whether or not faculty are using these collections. And I guess I sometimes find myself wondering, is it worth all this time and effort that we're putting into this?
Yes. Yes. That's all. I just want to put, I mean, yes, yes, yes. And one of the reasons that I think the object is getting a lot of attention in this moment is because the students are all over that digital material. They don't even buy books anymore, which is in a way very exciting because they're so plugged into those digital sources. But I think the most common question I've gotten this term is, how do you cite a digitized book? I mean, I've probably answered it 12 times this semester, which means that I do think, just to answer your question very quickly, that people are very, very excited about the digital resources. Where we go from there and how we work with that in our curriculum, think about it pedagogically is a different question. But as a graduate student myself, thank you so much for digitizing information, because it is huge. I mean, it's huge, and it's changing everything.
I have a son who's a graduate student at Penn State who teaches English, and I'm, as a librarian, always nagging him about taking his class to the library as opposed to just sending him to the library. And you've all talked a lot about working with students, but I know this is true in the law library, is nobody doubts what you're saying. The personal interaction between student, faculty, researcher, and librarian makes the most sense, but getting that to happen. And often faculty don't want to give up precious time in their classes to have the librarians even come in, but I think a much more powerful message is when the faculty member takes the students with them to the library. In any kind of way, look at an exhibit, look at where a section of the stacks or anything. So I'm just wondering, I think you, at least two of you, work with faculty, but what are the obstacles there? What's being successful in what you're doing to get faculty to put into their courses a research project that uses objects, or anything that goes beyond that one page, here are the margins for your paper kind of direction?
Did you want to say something?
Well, I take my class to the library every semester, and really wish I could do more than one day, but it's an essential part of the class, and it's something that I've been thinking about a lot in terms of how to set up for that so that it's they're more ready to make better use of that special hour. And so I think that what happens in that session is they are seeing someone who's excited about research. They are being talked to like people. And they're seeing, for example, if one student is led through a kind of search through a database, they're seeing that student discover something, get really excited, write something down, and they're seeing the exclusionary process begin, which is, in fact, narrowing of a topic, right? And so I think this gives them a lot of confidence. They follow up with the librarian, who is Sue Gilroy in my case, but that's just in my case. And I think this is terribly important. So much is demystified for them. They're really seeing examples of the kinds of interactions that they want to have more of, and I think they will have more of, and they do. I know that they follow up with librarians and see librarians, and in evaluations, they write about that day having been so important in their lives, and many of them form relationships with librarians and keep seeing them throughout their college career. So I would never remove that from my class. It would just be awful.
How do you get your colleagues to do the same?
Well, the people that teach what I teach, I think most, if not all of them, do this. So it's not something that I would really, I think everybody does this. They have a library day. But I think that, you know, people approach it differently. I have my students do something that I termed the introductory library tour. I teach the voice of authority, so I have to come up with names like that. So, and this sort of led them through some of the things that we were covering in the library session, so that when they got to the library session, we could talk about other kinds of things. And again, it had them sort of building at least some kind of history with the process, learning about some databases, and also introducing some ways of thinking about things like, for example, questions like, well, if you were going to go to different departments and institutes in this university to find people who might be talking about what you're talking about, which ones might you go to? And having them think about not discipline in the way, or field in the way that maybe makes them a little bit nervous, but just thinking about those buildings and the people that are in them and the conversations that might be going on there as a way of getting ready to talk about discipline and field and the kinds of databases and sources that they might want to access for their papers. So a lot happens in this session, and anticipation of it, and also following up after it.
So our time is up, and I want to thank all of you for taking time to join this conversation, especially thanks to Sue Gilroy, who is the co-author of the conversation here, the real author of the conversation. I'm just a shill. And thank you, Allison, RJ, Jane, and Stephanie, so much. We so appreciate it.